Com. As the citizens of Königsberg in the late 18th century watched the professor of logic and metaphysics go for his regular daily walk at precisely the same time each day, they must have wondered what he was thinking about. Well, one of Immanuel Kant's preoccupations was whether we could work out things about the world without experience, without, as it were, leaving the armchair, and substantial truths, not just what Kant called analytic truths. In other words, not just truths of definition, like all bachelors are unmarried men. This apparently arcane issue is at the heart of Kant's investigation of the limits of human knowledge in his Critique of Pure Reason. Professor Adrian Moore dispenses a wealth of knowledge from his armchair in St Hugh's College, Oxford.
Adrian Moore, welcome to Philosophy Bites.
Thank you very much, Nigel.
We're going to try and explain Kant's metaphysics today, so I wonder if we could just start by addressing the question, what is metaphysics?
Metaphysics can be usefully characterised as the most general attempt to try and make sense of things, to try and understand what reality is like, what the basic structure of reality is like.
So it's at the heart of philosophy. This seems to be one of the main drives in philosophy, to understand our relationship to our experience and the world.
Absolutely. I mean, it's in a way the core part of philosophy. Other branches of philosophy all depend on metaphysics in various ways. You could say that it's the part of philosophy that holds the rest of the discipline together.
Now, Immanuel Kant is most famous for his Critique of Pure Reason, and that's the work we're going to focus on today. It's an incredibly complex, difficult book, but it has a central theme running throughout. I wonder if you could try and summarise that.
It is an extraordinarily complicated book, as you say, and it's difficult to summarise, but we can say that Kant is fundamentally concerned with metaphysics in two senses. First of all, he's trying to do metaphysics in this book. He's trying to tell us something about the broad structure of reality, trying to make sense of things at the highest level of generality. But also, he's very interested in stepping up a level and raising questions about the nature of metaphysics itself, the scope and limits of metaphysics. Because one of the things that he was struck by when he looked at the work of his predecessors, stretching back over centuries, was that there hadn't been much in the way of consensus, not only about metaphysical issues themselves, but about how much was even possible within metaphysics. And his immediate predecessors had notably disagreed about what was possible within metaphysics. And thinking in terms of what we tend to refer to in a bit of a cartoon sketch as the rationalists and the empiricists, the thumbnail view is that according to the rationalists, it was possible by pure exercise of reason to arrive at substantive conclusions about the nature of reality. Whereas the empiricists were altogether more sceptical about that and thought that reason was much more limited than the rationalists took it to be, and that the only way that we could arrive at substantive conclusions about the nature of reality was to do the sort of thing that we have to do in the natural sciences, which is to appeal to experience. So Kant was very interested in this fundamental disagreement between the rationalists and the empiricists, and in a way, I suppose, tried to act as referee.
And one of the things he did in his role as referee was to come up with the notion of the synthetic a priori, which is fundamental to understanding the Critique of Pure Reason.
Absolutely. Let's think of this perhaps in terms of the dispute that we were just talking about between the rationalists and the empiricists. Kant was inclined to agree with the rationalists that it was possible to use pure reason to arrive at substantive conclusions about the nature of reality. He was inclined to agree with the empiricists that it was impossible to arrive at substantive conclusions about what was completely independent of us without using experience. And part of this notion of the synthetic a priori was his attempt to reconcile these.
So the first part of the synthetic a priori is the word synthetic, and that's contrasted with analytic.
Yes, Kant draws a distinction between what he calls synthetic knowledge and analytic knowledge. Analytic knowledge is knowledge that's available to us just by pure exercise of our concepts. Just reflecting on the nature of our concepts, we can arrive at certain basic, trivial truths about what things are like. We know, for example, that all sisters are female, not because we have to go out and investigate sisters to find out whether they fit the bill or not, but simply because it's part of our concept of a sister, that a sister should be female. So the truth, which it is, that all sisters are female, would count as an analytic truth for Kant. And that would contrast with something like the truth that some sisters are younger than their own siblings' children, for example, which again is a truth, but depends on the way things actually are, is not in any sense written into the concepts involved. And to ascertain that that's true, you need to go out and investigate.
So analytic truths are true by definition, and synthetic truths are the kind which you have to go out and do some kind of research to find out whether or not they actually are true.
That's right, yes.
Now, the other distinction, the difference between the a priori and what we haven't mentioned yet, a posteriori, how does that differ, that distinction, from the synthetic analytic distinction?
On the face of it, they look like two very similar distinctions. Standard way of characterising a priori knowledge is as knowledge which is available without appeal to experience. And a posteriori knowledge, or empirical knowledge as it's also sometimes called, is knowledge which is grounded in experience. And it can easily look as if these are just two ways of drawing the same distinction. I mean, the very two examples that we considered earlier of analytic knowledge and synthetic knowledge would also serve as examples of a priori knowledge and empirical knowledge. It's a priori that all sisters are female. You can tell that all sisters are female without appeal to experience. By contrast, although it's true that some sisters are younger than their own siblings' children, it's not something that can be ascertained without consulting experience. You actually have to investigate people, sisters in particular, to find out whether anybody fits the bill. And it turns out that there are some sisters that are younger than their own siblings' children. Nevertheless, although on the face of it it looks as if we've got two ways of drawing one and the same distinction, Kant is adamant that these two contrasts come apart from each other. And in particular, he believes that there is some knowledge which on the one hand is a priori, and yet on the other hand is synthetic.
So could you give an example of a synthetic a priori truth?
Many of Kant's own examples are mathematical. Probably the most famous of all is that 7 plus 5 is equal to 12. Now, this certainly for Kant counts as a priori. It is something that we can tell just by an exercise of reason. You can do mathematics in your armchair. You don't need to go out and get your hands dirty and investigate what the world is like. So in those terms, it's certainly an example of a priori knowledge rather than empirical knowledge. But, Kant says, mathematical methodology doesn't consist in simply reflecting on the nature of your concepts either. No matter how carefully you analyse your concepts, that's never going to be enough to give you the insight that 7 plus 5 equals 12. You have to appeal to something else. The arithmetical example is not necessarily the most convincing as far as that's concerned, but he did also often cite geometrical examples where it perhaps seems a little bit more plausible. So one of his favourite examples was that between 2 points you can only have one straight line. And again, he would have insisted that this was a priori, but not analytic. However closely you investigate your concept of straightness and your concept of a point and the various other concepts involved, that is never going to give you insight into this truth, Kant says. You have to consider the nature of space itself.
So we've got this puzzle. There are things which I can know sitting in my armchair without observing anything. I can think about things and discover truths about the nature of reality, not just about things which are true by definition. So if Kant's right, he's got a real puzzle on his hands. How does he solve that puzzle?
He solves it in the following way. He says what we're really uncomfortable with is the idea that there should be knowledge about what's out there independently of us, which we can nevertheless arrive at by pure reflection. And Kant agrees that such a thing is impossible. So his solution to the puzzle is to say the synthetic a priori knowledge that he's talking about isn't knowledge of what is out there independent of us. That's the key to the solution, if you like. Although this knowledge doesn't consist in pure reflection on our own concepts, it does nevertheless consist in pure reflection on our own intellectual apparatus, if you like. And the metaphor that's often used in this connection, which I think is a very helpful metaphor, is the metaphor of a pair of spectacles. It's as if we have innate spectacles through which we look at reality. And what we're doing when we arrive at synthetic a priori knowledge of things is we're reflecting on the nature of our own spectacles. It's synthetic because those spectacles themselves involve more than just concepts. We're not reflecting on the nature of our own concepts, but we are reflecting on the nature of our own spectacles. And in particular, as the geometrical example might have led us to expect, Kant believes that these spectacles include space and time themselves. Even space and time are part of how we view reality rather than part of reality itself.
So what you're saying is that for Kant, reality is not really accessible to us. What is accessible is the perceptual apparatus that we are endowed with, which is like a pair of spectacles. And if the spectacles have a rose tint, everything we perceive necessarily has a rose tint. Space and time are like the colours that we take to be out there because of our perceptual apparatus, rather than something independent of us.
Exactly. I think you've just expressed it very well, Nigel. So we can know, Kant believed, that between any 2 points there's only one straight line, because that's part of the intellectual apparatus that we carry around with us and that we impose onto reality when we're trying to make sense of reality, when we're trying to come to know what reality is like. And this is something that we can not only know, but can know a priori. We don't need to go out and investigate because it's part of our own intellectual equipment.
So does that mean that we can't really know how the world is? All we can know is how we perceive it?
That's exactly what it means, yes. And here at last we come back to the issue that we began with, which is the issue of where Kant stands in relation to metaphysics. And what he does in the Critique of Pure Reason is he follows through 2, in a way, separate projects, a positive project and a negative project. The positive part of the project is the part where he does as much within metaphysics as he feels can be done, spelling out how things must appear to us through our spectacles. And he believes that there are a whole range of interesting and substantive conclusions that can be drawn about that, about how things must appear to us through our spectacles. But as you just emphasised in the question that you put to me, appear is the operative phrase. The whole point is that there's this fundamental distinction that he's drawing between how things appear to us and how they are in themselves. The fact that we carry these native spectacles around with us means that there must be such a distinction. We can never take the spectacles off. We only have access to how things appear to us. How things are in themselves is something that we can't know. And that is the thing that Kant is wanting to emphasise in the negative project, which also occupies a substantial part of the critique. And it does mean, unfortunately, that a lot of the traditional questions of metaphysics we have to put to one side as just unanswerable. So that includes questions about, for example, the deity, whether there's a God or not, and if there is, what the nature of God is. And also questions about our own freedom, whether we have free will or not. Because Kant thinks that insofar as such a question arises, it's a question about how we are in ourselves, rather than about how we appear to ourselves.
So in a sense, what Kant's doing is setting the limits of what we can know in the process of telling us what we can know.
That's exactly right, and he's concerned with both. He's concerned with what lies within the limits, and he's concerned with what lies beyond the limits, and he's concerned with making sure that we draw the limits in the right place.
Now, it might seem to follow from that because we can't know about it, any discussion of reality, including whether there's a God or free will, is completely meaningless. Is that how Kant sees it?
That's an excellent question, Nigel, and it's very important to emphasise that that's not how Kant sees it. That is how other metaphysicians have seen it, and arguably that's how his great predecessor Hume saw things. That's not Kant's way of regarding the matter. Kant is adamant that these questions are perfectly meaningful. There is a reality out there. The fact that we have these spectacles through which we view things doesn't detract from the fact that there are things being viewed. There is a reality out there. There is a way it is, irrespective of whether we can know what it's like or not. The point is simply that we can't know what that reality is like in itself. But we're at liberty to speculate, and as far as the great religious questions are concerned, we're at liberty to have faith if we want that things are a certain way. So it is an article of faith that some people have, that there is a God. And Kant is far from wanting to deny people that article of faith. He thinks that what they believe, when they believe that there's a God, makes perfectly good sense. They may be right, they may be wrong, but certainly it makes perfectly good sense. All he's doing is telling them that they can't have knowledge of whether what they believe is true or not.
Now, the first critique is a massive tome, incredibly complex in its arguments. I mean, you've done a brilliant job of pulling out the main threads of the book, but it's such a complex work that must have been an intense labour. What do you think was motivating Kant in writing that book?
I think the answer to that question relates directly to the thing that we were most recently talking about. There's one very, very revealing sentence in the preface that he wrote to the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, where he said, I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. And it seems to me that one of the things that was really motivating Kant, probably the principal motivating factor, was this desire to safeguard articles of faith. But perhaps of even more fundamental concern to him was something that I touched on very briefly earlier, which is the idea that our own freedom is also a matter of how things are in themselves rather than how they appear to us through the spectacles. Because one thing that Kant was really concerned to do was to safeguard our belief in our own freedom and all that goes hand in hand with that, in particular our belief in the importance of morality, traditional Christian morality in Kant's case, which doesn't make sense unless we're free agents. Kant was keen to safeguard all of that against the threatening pretensions of the natural science, which at the time that he was writing really were threatening. Science had made astonishing progress in the preceding century, and in particular Newton's work had seemed to show that almost everything, if not everything, could be accounted for in purely scientific terms. It looked as if the world was a place where everything was governed by inexorable mechanical laws, and that in turn looked as if it posed a very serious threat to our belief in our own freedom and everything that goes hand in hand with that. And what Kant was able to do with this elaborate system that he had constructed was to show that we could both accept science in all its glory and cling fast to our belief in our own freedom by going back to this distinction that he drew between how things appear to us through the spectacles and how they are in themselves. Science is concerned with how things appear to us through the spectacles. Science is concerned with the world of space and time, the world of nature. And we can accept that through the spectacles everything is subject to inexorable causal laws, while at the same time accepting that we, as we are in ourselves, are free agents subject to the demands of morality.
So for Kant, the unknowable is genuinely unknowable, but it's still protected. He's protecting things like free will, the possibility of God's existence, even though we can't be absolutely sure about either of those things.
That's absolutely right, Nigel, yes.
The way you've summarised and discussed Kant's work, it's clear you've got a great appreciation of him as a philosopher. How would you rank him amongst other philosophers?
My own view is that he's probably the greatest of all.
Adrian Moore, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nigel.